and welcome to Mysterious Events. I'm your host, Stephen A. Mackay, a writer and podcaster with a lifelong interest in the strange and unexplained. Today I wanted to go back in time roughly 2,000 years to the birth of Jesus, or at least the birth of Christianity, and discuss a book that will be controversial for some but hopefully interesting to most of you. The Jesus Mysteries. Was the original Jesus a pagan god? First though, I want to thank Gordon Docherty and Steve Littrell for contributing to the Mysterious Events Beer Fund. They both donated to my page at buymeacoffee.com, and if you'd also like to buy me a cold one, you can find a link below and I'll give you a shout out on a future episode. Cheers Gordon and Steve. Okay, on with the show. We'll start with this from the Wikipedia page, always a good place to start your research, I find. The Jesus Mysteries is a 1999 book by British authors Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy, which advances the argument that early Christianity originated as a Greco-Roman mystery cult, and that Jesus was invented by early Christians based on an alleged pagan cult of a dying and rising god-man known as Osiris Dionysus. The authors propose that Jesus did not literally exist as an historically identifiable individual, but was instead a reinterpretation of the fundamental pagan god-man. That's a lot to take in, but essentially what the authors are saying is that Osiris, Dionysus, Mithras, Ion, and other pagan gods came first, and the Jesus story came about as a version of those mythical, allegorical, symbolic tales. Eventually, Christians came to believe this tale was based on actual historical events and an actual man, Jesus, but according to Freke and Gandy, it's all nonsense. You can see why this book and this theory is controversial, eh? In the first chapter, the authors lay out a few of the similarities between Osiris Dionysus and Jesus, including his father is God and his mother is a virgin. He's born on the 25th of December before 3 shepherds. He turns water into wine at a wedding. He rides into town on a donkey while folk wave palm leaves at him. He dies as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. His followers await his return as a judge. His death and resurrection are celebrated with bread and wine, which symbolise his body and blood. Now that's a lot of similarities. Coincidence? Surely not. So how does the Christian Church explain all this? Well, they apparently claim that the devil somehow gave the pagans knowledge of Jesus' true story before it happened, and then the pagans copied it. Diabolical mimicry is what it's called, and it's pretty ridiculous, so I think we can discount that idea. As the authors say, no single pagan myth has all the elements of the Jesus story, but the motifs do appear in various different ones. Take the virgin birth. Attis's mother was a virgin Cybele. Adonis's mother was a virgin called Myr. Ion in Alexandria had a virgin mother called Kore, or Kore, I don't know how you pronounce some of these names. And Dionysus' mother was Semele, or Semele. Which doesn't sound too good in English. But she was a virgin who was mysteriously impregnated by Zeus. Similarly, the birth date of December the 25th was previously used for Mithras, whose birth was also witnessed by 3 shepherds. That date was not always fixed though. In the early days of Christianity, January 6th was sometimes used, and this just happens to have been the birthday of the Alexandrian godman Ion. Both these dates are significant because they were used as the dates of the winter solstice. To me, it makes perfect sense that people would want to celebrate at the darkest time of the year, when food was scarce, the weather was terrible, and the land was barren and in its winter slumber. No wonder the pagans created a festival to cheer everyone up and to look ahead to the return of spring. The question is whether a real man named Jesus was born on December the 25th, or if the Christians simply took that date for their own mythical god-man. When Jesus was an adult, he was said to have turned water into wine at a wedding feast in Cana. This always struck me as a little odd. A frivolous way to use his powers if he really was the Son of God, surely. In the TV series Chosen, things like this are explained as Christ wanting to draw attention to himself because he has to die at the hands of the Romans to fulfil his purpose on earth, which is fair enough. However, before Christianity, Dionysus was said to have turned water into wine at his own marriage to Ariadne. In fact, at the temple of Dionysus on the island of Andros, Pliny says a stream of wine flowed, and if anyone carried the liquid outside, it would turn back to water. Then there was another pagan miracle worker called Empedocles, a disciple of Pythagoras who claimed he was an immortal god and cured people of sickness. He was even said to have raised a woman back to life after she'd been dead for a month. I don't know what that would have smelled like or looked like. Pretty freaky the stuff they got up to back then. Jesus, of course, was supposed to have resurrected Lazarus 500 years after Empedocles had performed his miracle. Apollonius of Tyana was another wandering godman who apparently brought the daughter of a Roman consul back to life. He also witnessed a miraculous feeding, similar to Jesus' feeding of the 5,000, a feat which Celsus, who was a 2nd century pagan critic of Christianity, says was an illusion performed by many holy men. One of the most dramatic miracles in the Bible is when Jesus exorcises a man of his demons, which he says are legion, because there's 2,000 of them. Jesus casts the demons into a herd of pigs which run off a hillside and drown. Pretty crap for the pigs if you ask me. Anyway, a very similar motif could be found at the mysteries of Eleusis, where 2,000 initiates bathed with pigs. This banished all evil into the pigs, which were then sacrificed by being chased over a chasm. Apart from both these stories really giving the innocent pigs a hard time, the similarities are undeniable. Of course, Christians would say Jesus performed true miracles, while the pagans were charlatans or illusionists, faking it, or even inspired by the devil. Celsus makes a fair point when he says, "Is it not a silly sort of argument to reckon by the same works that one man is a god, whilst his rivals are mere sorcerers?" Well, of course, but as we all know, history is written by the winners. Moving on, we find another similarity between Jesus and the pagan godmen with their disciples. Famously, Jesus had 12 disciples, but guess what? For the initiation ceremony in the mysteries of Mithras, 12 disciples surrounded the godman. The number 12 was not arbitrary or random, it came from Pythagorean mathematics, as freaking Gandhi write. They discovered that if a sphere, like planet Earth, was surrounded by others of the same dimensions, the central sphere will be surrounded by exactly 12 others. The image of the godman and his disciples encodes such teachings from sacred geometry. Again, this doesn't seem like mere coincidence. For Jesus to have 12 disciples suggests a deeper hidden significance. And that's really what the Jesus Mysteries is saying overall, that Christianity is just the surface level of what was originally a much deeper mystery tradition that people like the Gnostics would be initiated into. Nowadays the New Testament is seen as a historical document. I mentioned the show Chosen earlier, where Jesus actively draws the Romans' attention to himself because he knows he must be caught to fulfil his purpose on earth. Well, Dionysus also passively allowed himself to be caught by the authorities at the time, just as Jesus did hundreds of years later. King Pentheus interrogates Dionysus about his miracles and troublemaking, just as Pilate did with Jesus. As freaking Gandhi say, when Pilate reminds Jesus that he has the power to crucify him, Jesus replies, "You would have no authority at all over me had it not been granted you from above." Likewise, Dionysus answers the threats of Pentheus with, "Nothing can touch me that is not ordained." Like Jesus, who said of his persecutors, "They know not what they are doing," Dionysus tells Pentheus, "You know not what you are doing, nor what you are saying, nor who you are." Very, very similar ideas and words are being shared here, don't you think? What about the bread and wine of Christian Holy Communion? Well, it seems the pagans had a similar tradition long before the Christians. They were even accused of cannibalism, just as later Christians were. In the mysteries of Mithras, participants were offered a sacrament of water mixed with wine and bread, or consecrated wafers bearing a sign of the cross. Listen to this quotation. "He who will not eat of my body and drink of my blood, so that he will be made one with me and I with him, the same shall not know salvation." Where do you think that comes from? Very biblical, isn't it? Well, it's actually Mithras speaking. A passage in the Gospel of John mirrors it pretty closely. So let's wrap up all these similarities by looking at the final great event of Christ's life, his death. Dionysus was given a crown of ivy, similar to Jesus' crown of thorns, and dressed in purple robes, similar to Jesus, who was also dressed in purple when being ridiculed by Roman soldiers. Jesus was crucified between two thieves, one of which ascends with him to heaven while the other goes to hell. Mithras was also pictured with two torchbearers on either side of him, one with his torch pointing up to heaven, the other pointing down. Dionysus was also pictured in the same way. These torchbearers were supposed to represent the higher self and the lower self. Again, we're seeing Christianity taking something which originally held a deeper allegorical or mystical meaning, and it becomes just another part of the story. Do you know how Dionysus was said to have died? Take a guess. As freaking Gandhi say, it seems incredible that Osiris Dionysus could have been portrayed as meeting exactly the same death as Jesus, but this is what the evidence suggests. In some vases, Dionysus is shown hanging from a cross. A talisman from the 2nd or 3rd century CE shows a crucified figure you would recognise immediately as Jesus, but it's actually Dionysus. You can see a picture of this on my social media, check it out, it's amazing. And strangely, it is a remarkable fact that we have no representations of a crucified Jesus before the 5th century CE, according to freaking Gandhi. I'll wrap this section up soon, but first, what about Easter? The mystery god-man Attis had a very similar death and resurrection to Jesus. An effigy of Attis was hung up on a pine tree, and then buried in a sepulchre, and on the 3rd day he rose again. Osiris too was said to have descended to hell when he died, then rose from the dead on the 3rd day, just as Jesus was later claimed to have done. I don't know about you, but I've found all these similarities fascinating. They can't all be coincidence, can they? Whoever wrote the Gospels would have been familiar with the earlier pagan tales. Could it even be possible that a real, living man had a life with so many of those mythic events happening to him? Water into wine, virgin birth, all that? Freaking Gandhi suggests that if all the pagan elements of Jesus' story are removed, there'd be nothing left. He'd be a myth, not a historical man at all. They believe that in the first few centuries BCE, a Jewish version of the earlier pagan mysteries was produced, drawing in elements from the stories of Osiris, Dionysus, Attis, Mithras and so on, and in time this myth came to be seen as historical fact, and Christianity was the end product. They ask, very pertinently, if we had not been brought up in a Christian culture, would we have ever interpreted the Gospels as anything other than myths? It's a very good question. For me, the book started to lose my interest after the early chapters, so I'll kind of skim through most of what else the authors had to say. Firstly, they say there's no evidence for Jesus ever being a real person. There's records of Pontius Pilate, but not of Jesus being tried, or executed or living at all. Freaking Gandhi also tell us there were hundreds of Gospels, but most are clearly mythical, so we must look at the big four. No, not Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer and Anthrax, but Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Now, these four are the ones we all know, the ones we were probably brought up studying, but the fact is, although they're viewed as historical documents now, they don't actually agree in many points. Mark, for example, doesn't mention Bethlehem or the virgin birth at all. Matthew and Luke include genealogies of Jesus' descent from David, but they're completely different. And anyway, what's the point, since both those Gospels make it clear that Joseph isn't Jesus' father, God is. Luke says Jesus was born in the year 6 CE. Matthew says it was 4 BCE. And Luke even has his dates so wildly out of sync that Mary must have been pregnant with Jesus for 10 years. Other Gospels that are included in the New Testament are looked at as well. Paul doesn't even have Jesus being crucified. He says Jesus was hung in a gibbet. And the Acts of Apostles say he was hung on a tree. Judas Iscariot hanged himself in Matthew. But the Acts of Apostles say he died from an accidental fall. And then, the Gospel writers, who were supposedly Jesus' close friends and there at his death, can't agree on what his last words were. Matthew and Mark say it was, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Well, Luke has him saying, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And John claims he said, "I am thirsty," and then, "It is finished." The thing is, the Gospels were not originally known by the names we have now. Matthew, Mark, Paul and so on. Those were acquired later. The Gospels were also added to and altered over the years. The whole section where the risen Jesus appears to his stunned disciples was not even in the original Gospels, it was added later. In fact, the only Gospel that scholars believe was written by someone who might have been alive at the same time as Jesus was the Gospel of Mark, written around 70 CE. But Mark doesn't even claim to have known Jesus personally. A German scholar in 1919 showed that Mark had created his Gospel by linking together existing small stories. The Jesus story had been constructed from pre-existing fragments. There's a fair bit more of this, but I think we've made our point, and it's quite a powerful one if you are hoping to use the Gospels as historical proof of Jesus' existence. At least going on the evidence Pagan God have provided us with. If we take all this evidence as truth, you have to wonder, how did Christianity end up as the dominant religion in the world for hundreds of years? Well, the Jesus Mysteries goes some way to explain this later on in the book, as it tells us that Clement of Rome, also known as Bishop Clement I, proclaimed that whoever refused to bow the neck to the bishops is guilty of insubordination against Christ, and they should receive the death penalty. That doesn't seem very Christ-like to me, but it does give you an idea of how the religion became so powerful. Ultimately, the Romans chose Christianity as their state religion, and this is how it came to conquer the world, which is ironic since it was the Romans who killed Jesus in the first place. The Romans had tried various religions, but Christianity was ideal as it encouraged the faithful to have blind faith in those holding power, like the bishops. And the bishops could be controlled by the Roman emperors, so it was a match made in heaven. I liked the little section in the Jesus Mysteries where we're told Constantine, or Constantine, however you want to pronounce it, who was the first Christian emperor, deliberately postponed being baptised until his deathbed so he could continue sinning and yet be assured of a heavenly afterlife. Seems like a good plan. After Constantine adopted Christianity, the church terrorised pagans, torturing them, chaining their priests up to their shrines and leaving them to starve to death, burning them alive, commandeering their shrines, which were then transformed into Christian churches. So, that's just a fairly quick look at what the Jesus Mysteries contains within its pages. It seems quite convincing, and I was certainly swayed by it when I first read it. Back then the internet was nothing like it is now though, and it was impossible to really look deeper into a book like this without going to a lot of trouble and expense. How would you even have went about it unless you were willing to expend a lot of time and resources? Nowadays it's somewhat easier, so let's take a look at some of the criticism of Pagan God's work and the underlying ideas. First off, we turn again to that bastion of scholarship, Wikipedia. I'm taking the piss a bit, but I honestly love Wikipedia and I donate to it when I can, as I think it offers a superb starting point for any investigation or research. So this is what they have to say on the Christ myth theory that underpins Pagan God's book. The question of Jesus' historicity was settled in scholarship in the early 20th century, and mythicism is rejected as a fringe theory by virtually all mainstream scholars of antiquity and has been considered fringe for more than 2 centuries. It is criticised for commonly being presented by non-experts, its reliance on arguments from silence, lacking evidence, the dismissal or distortion of sources, questionable methodologies and outdated comparisons with mythology. It seems that scholars generally agree that there were 2 versions of Christ, a real one and the one of faith. They believe that there are 2 events in Christ's life that did actually happen, his baptism and his crucifixion, thus proving he was a real historical person. As per Wikipedia, to establish the existence of a person without any assumptions, one source from one author, either a supporter or opponent, is needed. For Jesus, there are at least 12 independent sources from 5 authors in the 1st century from supporters, and 2 independent sources from 2 authors from non-supporters. New Testament scholar Bart D. Ehrman states that Jesus certainly existed, as virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees. On the claim that there are no eyewitness accounts of Jesus, Ehrman estimates that there are about 30 surviving independent sources written by 25 authors who attest to Jesus, and a couple of other biblical scholars say that even if ancient sources were to be silent on any individual, they would not impact their historicity, since there are numerous instances of people whose existence is never doubted and yet were not mentioned by contemporary authors. I'm not so sure that's much of an argument, to be honest. Jesus was real even if no one mentioned him, because lots of people lived and were never mentioned. I'm not really following the logic in that, to be fair. It's not convincing me at all. There's a whole page in Wikipedia about the subject. It's way too long to get into here, and honestly, I'm not that convinced by what I see there. Check it out for yourself though. The link is in the show notes, and let me know what you think about it. Something that is more convincing is a link to a page where a Bible scholar looks at the amulet that's on the cover of the Jesus Mysteries that the authors say depicts Osiris Dionysus. I mentioned it earlier in the episode. I think I said it was amazing. Well, one scholar believes that amulet is fake, and again you can find a link to the website where he goes into detail on why he thinks this. I can understand where he's coming from, and in fact he says freaking Gandhi knew about the same concerns he had. Ultimately summing up, James Hannam says, not only is the cover of the Jesus Mysteries probably a fake, but at least one author of the book knew this and kept quiet about it. Probably a fake? That's not really evidence, is it? Probably. Again, I'm not convinced by the argument here, but do look at the link in the show notes, decide for yourselves and let me know what your opinion is. Wikipedia again. Chris Forbes, an ancient historian and senior lecturer at Macquarie University in Sydney, has criticised the Jesus Mysteries, noting that freaking Gandhi are not real scholars, they are popularisers. So what, does that mean they can't be right? I don't think so, it seems a bit elitist to me. He calls their arguments about Jesus grossly misconceived, and their attempt to draw links between Jesus and various pagan god men is completely muddled. It looks impressive because of the sheer mass of the material, but when you break it down and look at it point by point, it really comes to pieces. Well, this sounds interesting. So let's check out his comments in more detail. As ever, links in the notes so you can read it all yourself. As an example, Dr. Forbes points out that parallels drawn between the virgin birth of Christ and so-called virgin births in the mystery religions are false. While there are a number of extraordinary births referred to in the pagan mysteries, Dr. Forbes says he can find no evidence of any case where the mother is said to be a virgin. That is pretty damning if true. Unfortunately, the rest of the article is just like the others, vague and insulting towards freaking Gandhi's book without getting into any detail to explain to the layperson why. Read the piece yourself and see if you agree with me. It just sounds like some scholars get pissed off that some non-scholars had the hubris to write a best-selling book about a subject they hadn't spent years studying at university. Come on, if it's such a load of crap, give us a point-by-point rebuttal. Just saying any good historian, Christian or not, will laugh at half this book and will be very upset by the other half because the book is very misleading, as Forbes does. It proves absolutely nothing. Similarly, when the BBC approached N.T. Wright asking him to debate freaking Gandhi concerning their thesis in the Jesus Mysteries, N.T. Wright replied that this was like asking a professional astronomer to debate with the authors of a book claiming the moon was made of green cheese. Hilarious, but again, doesn't tell us why freaking Gandhi are bullshit artists, does it? Why wouldn't this guy N.T. Wright go on the radio show and debate the issue? Make freaking Gandhi look like the clowns he thinks they are. Instead he just refuses and you're left wondering why. It's ridiculous. Finally on this point, author and activist Richard Carrier has stated that the Jesus Mysteries will disease a reader's mind with rampant unsourced falsehoods and completely miseducate. Although Carrier himself supports the view that Jesus was not a real person, he's condemned the viewpoints on ancient world and ancient religion presented in the Jesus Mysteries as ludicrous and without merit. I've no idea why he said that, but if you check out his article, you'll see that he's actually defending some of freaking Gandhi's points. At this stage I just get fed up trying to find a decent rebuttal of the Jesus Mysteries. The problem is, freaking Gandhi wrote a book that was easy for the layperson to read. The scholars don't seem to believe there's any need to do something similar, so we're left without a kind of real rebuttal and, you know, that we can understand easily and using a podcast like this. Anyway, this has been a long episode so far. Let's try to sum things up a bit. I first read this book when I was in my early 20s, I believe. I was reading a lot of books about alternative history at the time, like The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock and Act of God by Graham Phillips. I remember thinking the Jesus Mysteries was a really good read, and since I'd been brought up a Christian, it really shocked me. I'm no longer in my early 20s, I'm closer to 50 now, and it would take a mythical godman to give me back my thick curly head of hair. How do I think the book stands up now that I'm older, wiser and balder? Well, I didn't really enjoy the read, I have to be honest. Don't get me wrong, the early chapters where they start to lay out their theory and compare Christianity to the pagan traditions is great, but my interest started to really wane even before I was halfway through the reread. The later chapters just aren't as interesting as the first ones, and their argument kinda loses momentum as the book goes along. Is it worth reading? Probably. You can find the paperback dirt cheap on eBay, but it really hasn't held up well since it was first published. And I'm absolutely certain there's strong scholarly arguments to prove that much of it is nonsense, if only I could find them. Ultimately, does it really matter what this book says about the history of Christianity? It's interesting, but will it convert Christians into pagans? Of course not. Staunch believers in the literal Christ will look at the bad reviews of freaking Gandhi's thesis, and there's plenty of them, and use those to bolster their faith. On the other hand, anyone who already thinks Christianity is a load of nonsense will use the book as an argument to prove their opinion is right. The Jesus Mysteries simply does not put across a strong enough argument to sway opinions on either side. That's not even the author's fault. The lack of sources and the fact that 2 millennia separate us from the people living through that time mean that no one could provide an absolutely rock solid case one way or the other. Personally, I think the Jesus Mysteries is probably right about a lot of things, but does it really matter? I was brought up a Christian, but I stopped caring about religion when I was a teenager, and I discovered things like beer, girls and death metal. Over the course of my life, I've often wished that I retained that early faith in Christianity though, because it's a great support for people going through things like depression and grief, something I know only too well. For that reason, I don't wish to tear down any religion. If you're a believer, I envy your faith and I wish you all the best. With that said, I do think the Jesus Mysteries throws up some very interesting questions. Some good detective work in it as far as I can tell, and it's a book that any open-minded person might want to check out. As I say, it's dirt cheap on eBay, you can get it for £2 or £3 delivered. So whether you believe the Bible is real or not, you can't deny there's some fantastic stories in there, especially the Old Testament. But the life of Jesus is a great tale as well. I've been watching The Chosen recently, as I mentioned, and I'd recommend it to anyone interested in historical fiction, historical stories. It's very well done, although some of the episodes are kind of boring with nothing happening. When the odd miracle happens though, wow, it's great viewing, quite moving. Give it a try. If you can find it on a streaming service, that is. One season's on Netflix, and others on Amazon Prime, and others in God knows where. Well, that's it for this episode of Mysterious Events. If you're enjoying the show and you'd like to support us with the running costs, you can buy me a beer at the link in the show notes. If you'd like to hear more from me while you wait for the next episode, check out Rock Paper Swords, the historical action and adventure podcast that I co-host with best-selling author Matthew Harvey. The link is in the show notes again. Please also take a look at my historical adventure novels. Most are free with Kindle Unlimited, and my newest one, Sword of the Saxons, comes out on the 4th of July this year. Cheers all, and until next time, seek the mysteries.